Good afternoon. Welcome everyone, students, faculty, staff, and all our community friends. We're delighted you're here. This is the latest program in the Creative Intelligence series, and I want to give a special thanks to the Transylvania Department of Education for helping to make this possible. It is a great privilege to present Dr. Genie Scott, scientist, author, engaging speaker, has contributed so much to science and to education. My friend.
Well, good afternoon. Scientists overwhelmingly accept that living things have common ancestors. That's what evolution is. But there's a notable gap between what scientists accept and what the general public believes about evolution. Anti-evolutionism in the United States has been depressingly consistent. Gallup polls in the United States over the last 40 or more years have shown a very low acceptance of evolution. The top line, humans were specially created in their present form, regularly showing about mid to high 40%. The middle line, humans evolved, this evolution was guided by God, middle to high 30%. And the bottom line, humans evolved, but God had nothing to do with it, around 12 or 14%. So roughly about half of Americans accept evolution, roughly about half of Americans reject evolution as a valid scientific idea. Now, this anti-evolutionism is fed at least in part by the many creationist organizations that flourish in the United States. And this is obviously just a small sample of the many Young Earth Creationist organizations. There's many other Old Earth Creationist organizations. There are intelligent design organizations. There really are quite a few organizations out there trying very hard to convince the public that evolution is false science, or at least science that students should not have to pay any attention to. Anti-evolutionists are special creationists in their theology. And special creationism is a particular kind of Christian theology that is concerned with how God created. After all Christians believe that God created, but there are many ways by which God can create. In special creationism, God creates everything in its present form. So the universe, the stars, the galaxies, the planet Earth, the solar system, plants and animals on planet Earth, human beings, the whole universe is created pretty much as you see it. If you were to go back in time, you'd see pretty much what you see today. There really hasn't been any appreciable change since that special creation event. In terms of biology, special creationists believe that kinds of organisms were created specially by God, and these kinds of organisms have limited genetic variability. I'll talk a little bit later on about the creationist orchard, in which you can get evolution within a kind, but certainly no connection between the kinds. This is not an evolutionary system. This is a separate creation of the kinds, pretty much as it says in a literal reading of the Bible. And for most kinds of special creationism, this creation event occurred pretty much at one time over the 6 24-hour days of the week of creation. I'll talk a little bit later on about some of the intelligent design creationists. They, like most of the other Old Earth creationists, don't so much believe in special creation over a single short period of time, but sequentially through time, which is another type of creationism. The most important aspect of special creationism, though, is this first point, that God creates everything in its present form. There hasn't been a cumulative change in cosmology or geology or biology or anthropology. There hasn't been this evolutionary change over time, and living things do not have common ancestors. The special creation point of view is reflected in two kinds of creationism. One, Young Earth Creationism, which is a form of special creationism in which the adherents believe that God created everything in its present form about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. It's the more radical ones who push it up to that higher level, as opposed to the billions of years of age that the geologists and other scientists tell us the Earth has been around. There also are old Earth creationists. And old Earth creationists are special creationists in that they believe God created everything specially as we see it today, but that they also accept the physics and chemistry and geology of the evidence for there being a very old planet, a very old Earth. And so old Earth creationists generally fall into the category, at least most of them fall into the category of being progressive creationists, where God creates things specially, but sequentially through time. So, first God created single-celled organisms, and then he came back and created simple multi-celled organisms, and then more complicated multi-celled organisms, and then the body plans of the Cambrian explosion, and then simple vertebrates, and then more complicated vertebrates, and lions and tigers and bears all the way up. So sequential or progressive creationism is something that you tend to find among old Earth creationists, but it is a special creation point of view. It's not an evolutionary point of view, even though an ancient age of the Earth is accepted in this view. Now, people are always saying, well, what about the intelligent design guys? Where did they fall in this dichotomy? And intelligent design really spans both. You find supporters of intelligent design who are young Earthers and supporters who are old Earthers. What intelligent design is, the intelligent design form of creationism, it is a form of special creationism. They are saying that things that are very, very complicated or things that are very, very improbable, like the classic example of the motor rotor of the bacteria flagellum, these things couldn't possibly have evolved through natural causes. So therefore, an intelligence must be involved. Now, that's just a very fancy way of saying God specially created something like the bacteria flagellum motor. So it is a form of special creationism, even though members of the Discovery Institute break out in hives when I call them creationists, but nonetheless, that is really what their beliefs hold. If you want to compare evolution and special creationism, evolution views living things as having common ancestors, and like a family tree, living things will form a tree of descent. The creationist view living things as being related more like a lawn of separate blades of grass rather than a tree. You have separate creations, unconnected in any kind of genealogical relationship, which is the case with evolution. More modern creationists are viewing living things more of an orchard than a lawn, where you have a specially created kind, like the dog kind or the horse kind or the duck kind, and then within that specially created kind, you have evolution within the kind. And so you have something that looks a little bit like a single tree, but it's not a tree in the sense that evolution is a tree. And one reason why the intelligent design proponents are considered to be creationists is that, as illustrated in this book from the Discovery Institute, Explore Evolution, they present basically that same idea of the creationist orchard. This is not an evolutionary point of view. So, creationists have been around, really, the young Earth creationists date back to the early to mid 1960s. The intelligent design creationists are a more recent player upon the stage, but all the creationists have been promoting ideas about evolution for several decades now, most of which are just simply scientifically wrong. And they have also made some comments about Darwin, which are specifically wrong historically, and I'll actually be talking a little bit more about that tomorrow night if you're not sick to death of this topic by then. Be speaking over at UK while I'm in Lexington. So I'm going to begin to try to answer that question, which is kind of a fun one. What would Darwin say to today's creationists? Well, the first thing he would say is, what deathbed confession? Wonderful book by Jim Moore called The Darwin Legend talks about the story of how the urban legend of how on his deathbed Darwin confessed that he no longer accepted evolution, he was very sorry for having developed the idea, and that he now had become a good Christian on his deathbed, and so forth. And so, where did this get started? In 1915, a Lady Hope claimed to have visited Darwin on his deathbed back in 1881. And she claimed that he had confessed exactly what I said, that he was sorry for having developed evolution, and that he now accepted Jesus and he was ready to go and see his maker. Elizabeth Reed Cotton was born in 1842 in Tasmania, and at the age of 35, she married Sir James Hope, who was of the tender age of 69. She was an evangelist and a pamphleteer, a temperance crusader, and she claimed to have visited Darwin at Down House. And this, of course, is debated. I mean, was it likely that she actually did visit Darwin? Well, James Moore thinks that it's quite probable she did visit him, and maybe sometime during the early 1880s. Darwin died in 1882. There was an evangelist in Down, the village where Darwin and his family lived, named James Fegan, who was also a temperance crusader, but who was very, very pro-education. And what Fegan would do is he would bring young boys, or some of them orphans, street boys, homeless kids really, from London out to the countryside, which is where Down was, for vacations. And Fegan visited Down House with a group of boys, and these boys sang some hymns for Darwin, and Darwin was just totally charmed, gave everyone 6 pence, which was actually a whole lot of money back then. And the little boys were really happy about that too. And in fact, Darwin had a pretty close relationship with this guy because that fall he let Mr. Fegan use the sort of one of the external buildings of Down House to use as a school. So, there was a relationship between Darwin and this man Fegan. Moore thinks that when Fegan became ill in the summer of 1881, Lady Hope replaced him. And she would very likely have been invited or would have been able to ask to see Darwin's, and they were of the proper social class and all that. So quite possibly, she actually did visit Down House. The first major telling of the Darwin legend was in August of 1915, considerably later than the actual purported visit. And Lady Hope was in the United States taking part in a Baptist evangelical revival with a number of other guest speakers. Now, one of the speakers, local color here, was A.T. Robertson from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. And who was the main speaker in this evangelistic series. And Lady Hope told him that Darwin had confessed his love of Scripture on his deathbed, and that in his youth he had said things that were not true. And a version of this story that she presented at this revival was published in the Watchman Examiner, which is a Baptist publication. She quoted Darwin as saying, quote, "I was a young man with unformed ideas. I threw out queries, suggestions, wondering all the time over everything. And to my astonishment, the ideas took like wildfire. People made a religion out of them." Now, some of the quotes attributed to Darwin are quite fantastical and quite unlike the way he wrote or likely spoke. Imagine what you know about Darwin saying, "Oh," he replied, "those theories of evolution. Oh, I put out those theories when I was a young man, searching for knowledge, and they made a religion of them. Oh, if I could only undo them." And Dr. Darwin appeared much agitated as he said these words, evidently thinking that his hypotheses had done great harm. Well, this is probably not likely, but the story spread very widely and clearly was embellished. There were more things that were claimed that had been said at the deathbed and so forth. Different versions had Darwin renouncing evolution, speaking of his love of Christ, and going into great detail. Now, the Darwin family indignantly denied all of this and denied ever having met Lady Hope. But of course, this is 1915. By this time, Emma was dead, and the children would have been small in the 1880s. They probably would not have really remembered any particular guest who came by. But they clearly had no knowledge of any deathbed confession by Charles Darwin. And, probably Lady Hope's memories of this visit, which quite possibly took place. Probably Lady Hope's memories were also embellished a little by time, and we have to be sympathetic to one's psychology. We tend to believe more easily the things we want to believe than necessarily the things that actually happen. And so maybe we'll cut Lady Hope some slack here, but it's highly unlikely that Darwin renounced evolution on his deathbed. And it is, which of course was what his children were so upset about when this story began to circulate in the early 1900s. It's also quite unlikely that he became a Christian on his deathbed either. His personal views about Jesus and Christianity were made fairly clear in his autobiography. He wrote that he felt that Christianity, because of its doctrine of damnation for, as the Anglican Church was interpreting it at the time, doctrine of damnation for anyone who was not a Christian, would mean that his father and grandfather, who were freethinkers, would go to hell. And that, as he said, was a damnable doctrine. So he didn't, he wasn't keen on the organized Christian church for any particular, and he was pretty firm about those beliefs. There's speculation, which is debated by Darwin scholars, about whether the death of his beloved daughter Annie at the age of 10 might have been a turning point for Darwin's religious beliefs. Annie was his favorite child. He had 10 kids. Believed in natural selection, I guess. I don't know. But he was this huge family. How many of you saw the movie Creation? Came out a couple of years ago. Anybody see that? Paul Bettany. It's a good movie. You should check it out. Get it from Netflix. Actually, the portrayal of Darwin in that movie was pretty darn good, except they didn't show him with a big enough family. They only showed him with 4 kids. Heck, they just started. But he really was a very loving father and very much a family man, and just lavished lots of care and love on his children. But even with this big family, Annie really was. He loved all of his children, but he and Annie had a special bond. They were intellectually and emotionally very close, and her death, which was a very painful, and the death is presented in the movie in a very heartfelt way, and probably pretty close to accurate, given Darwin's own and Emma's accounts of this very sad period of their life. But Jim Moore and some other scholars believe that this was a turning point, and this was when he really decided that he could not accept a Christian God that would take an innocent child like Annie and let her die this very painful and prolonged death. In other words, the theodicy issue was the issue in Christianity that was most upsetting to him. We don't know for sure, and I'm sure scholars will continue to debate. But his views on religion might very well have been influenced by his friend Thomas Henry Huxley, who invented the term agnosticism. Huxley believed that in this world we can never know, and he felt that the proper view for a scientist was to just not make a judgment on whether there was or was not a God. In fact, if you read Huxley, it's kind of interesting because he blasts the churchmen for claiming that they know the mind of God, but he also blasts the atheists for claiming that they know what God is not like or that God is not there. And he thinks the proper view is agnosticism, holding in abeyance your decision as to whether or not there is a God. But Darwin wrote to his friend and fellow scientist, the American minister Asa Gray, that when it came to contemplating the nature of God, quote, "I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can. Certainly, I agree with you that my views are not at all necessarily atheistical." So, Darwin's attitudes and ideas toward religion were complicated, but a deathbed confession is pretty unlikely. And renouncing evolution, which is an idea that he had supported all of his life and all of his decades of research that he conducted at Down House and correspondence with other scientists all over the world, clearly this is not an idea that he would have let go with very casually. Well, one of the things that Darwin would probably not be surprised to hear, that modern creationists attack the validity of evolution. There certainly was opposition to the idea of living things having common ancestors during his time as well. This stern-looking chap here is J. William Dawson of McGill University, a geologist who was a staunch anti-evolutionist, who wrote in 1894 that it's true that a tide of criticism hostile to the integrity of Genesis has been rising for some years, but it seems to be beat valiantly against a solid rock, and the ebb has now evidently set in. The battle of historical and linguistic criticism may indeed rage for a time over the history and date of the Mosaic Law, but insofar as Genesis is concerned, it has been practically decided by scientific explanation. 1894. 1903, it seems plain the reaction is commenced and that the pendulum that has swung so strongly in the direction of evolution is now oscillating the other way. 1935, and I love this one, Harry Rimmer. Oh God, I wish I could write like this. The chain of evidence that purports to support the theory of evolution is a chain indeed, but its links are formed of sand and mist. Love it. Analyze the evidence and it melts away. Turn the light of true investigation upon the demonstration and they fade like fog before the freshening breeze. Yeah. 1935, evolution's right on the way out the door, guys. 1988, leading scientists are abandoning their faith in Darwin's theory of evolution. 1998, that Darwinian creation story has held sway for more than 100 years. It's now on the way out. 2005, there's no question that Darwin's theory is creaking and tottering and will implode soon. And of course, 2000, the jury's still out. So it seems that every year, evolution is just that closer to being knocked off the stage. And somehow or another, university scientists keep teaching it. Amazing. They must not know the fragility of evolution. Well, of course, these views are not shared in the scientific community. Evolution is considered, the idea that living things have common ancestors is not an argument. We debate the details. We'll argue a whole lot about mechanisms of evolution. We'll argue a whole lot within science about who's related to whom and who is descended from whom, what the pattern of the tree of life is, and how important is natural selection, how important are other mechanisms, but whether living things have common ancestors is just not being debated in science. And you don't have to take my word for it. This is a university, so just go over to your library and pull up half a dozen or so science journals, Science or Nature or Cell or AI, American Scientist, whatever, and just look through the table of contents and see if any of the articles being published in these scientific journals are questioning whether living things have common ancestors. Now, you'll find a lot of research going on about the details, but you're not going to find anybody questioning the whether. And that, of course, is what the creationists are talking about. Well, Darwin would also have been very surprised at the re-emergence of the idea that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. While a student at Edinburgh, he had studied geology extensively, and actually his first scientific papers were geological papers. We think of him as with the theory of biological evolution, but his first several monographs and his first scientific paper was actually on geology. He started out as a geologist first. And he knew very well that geologists since the 1700s had been making discoveries and observations that made it very, very unlikely that a literal Genesis interpretation of a planet a few thousand years old was highly unlikely. Geologists of the 17th and 18th century were establishing knowledge of the Earth in a very systematic way. William Smith, the subject of Simon Winchester's wonderful book, The Map That Changed the World, surveyed most of England in terms of the needs of the Industrial Revolution. Canals and railroad beds were being dug and laid, respectively, and you needed to know what kind of soil you were putting that canal in so the water wouldn't, all run away. So Smith was commissioned to do a very thorough geological survey of England, and The Map That Changed the World was exactly it. It was this map of the whole British Isle. I mean, it was a fabulous, fabulous piece of science. And he was able to illustrate many of the principles that Steno had presented back in the 1600s, the principle of stratigraphic continuity and so forth and so on. Anyway, there was a great deal of knowledge that was being developed during the 1700s and 1800s by geologists, casting serious doubt on the idea of a young Earth. And there was a group around the turn of the 1800s, which was Darwin's century, the first couple of decades of the 1800s, they called themselves scriptural geologists. And they were really a rear guard movement trying to promote the idea that the Earth was only a few thousand years old, a la Bishop Ussher. But by the 1830s, 40s, when Darwin was doing his major intellectual work and traveling around the world on the Beagle, the scriptural geologists were already an anachronism. So the rebirth of young Earth creationism would be a real surprise to Darwin. Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, was published just in time for Darwin to take the first volume with him on the voyage of the Beagle, and he was very excited by Lyell's radical ideas of uniformitarianism, that the processes that we see operating today in erosion and mountain building and so forth are the same processes that can explain the ancient world. We don't have to come up with new processes. Uniformitarianism, by the way, does not mean that everything that happened in geological history is slow and gradual. Lyell and Darwin and the other scientists of the day knew that there were catastrophic events that produced geological changes, but it's the process that is the uniformity, as it were, from one time to another. Not the rate doesn't have to be the same. But clearly, it was obvious from looking at things like erosion that to cut a canyon took a very long time. And so through Lyell's work and that of the other scholars of the 1700s and 1800s, it was clear that young Earthism was really simply wrong. Now, the idea that the Earth is young was really a 20th century renewal of an idea, and it was brought up by the creationists. It is a key part of modern young Earth creationism. And you can sort of see why, given their views about evolution. Evolution must be wrong. It disagrees with a literal interpretation of the Bible. Clearly, if there's enough time for evolution, it makes it much more difficult for them to make their arguments. So a young Earth is very essential, because frankly, if it's an old Earth, then there's enough time for evolution, and the evidence is so strong that it's really very difficult. So there are lots of young Earth arguments that you find among the modern-day creationists. There's a whole field of young Earth creationism called flood geology, in which all the sedimentary features of the planet, everything from where we are today to the Himalayas and Death Valley and Grand Canyon and everything, all of the sedimentary deposits that we see on planet Earth are the result of Noah's flood, which geologically speaking is making quite an extravagant claim. And you can see how they correlate standard geological time period with a very short young Earth chronology. If there are any geologists in the audience, they're on the floor laughing at this point, because this is just absurd geology. Just as a quick example, the Grand Canyon is part of the Colorado Plateau. It's this very large sort of dome structure of sedimentary deposits that extends over hundreds of thousands of acres in the central plains there. And beginning with the Grand Canyon, moving up to Bryce and the other Grand Staircase, part of the West, if you've ever been there. And the creationist view of the Colorado Plateau is that the basal granites and schists, notice how carefully I pronounce that word, of the Grand Canyon are actually pre-flood. This was the original world created during the week of creation. And the Grand Canyon itself was laid down, those strata were, 4,000 feet of strata were laid down in the early flood. But wait, there's more. There's the whole Colorado Plateau, and that is late flood and post-flood. This is very, very rapid sedimentation, folks, because all of this happened during the year that the waters covered the Earth entirely, and then they gradually started to recede, and all of these layers were laid down. Now, if you're interested in why Grand Canyon is not catastrophically deposited, and catastrophically cut too, by the way. Grand Canyon was supposedly cut in a period of about a week. You might consider coming to the National Center for Science Education's Grand Canyon raft trip, because we really have an awful lot of fun here. We talk about the creationist view of the canyon, and then we have a geologist talk about the standard geological scientific interpretation of Grand Canyon. Here we are looking at a really interesting sandstone slab from the Coconino sandstone that's fallen down from above. And there's some lovely little four-footed animals, little tetrapod prints, some amphibian or early reptile that scampered across this piece of sandstone when it was wet and then was preserved. The creationists will take a look at those footprints and say, aha, small creatures trying to escape the rising waters of the flood. That doesn't work really well, since this slab is way up high in the Grand Canyon. And what's particularly tough about working this into your flood model is that underneath the Coconino sandstone is a layer of limestone which is laid down by marine sediments. That's a water lane area, a layer. And the Coconino sandstone is wind lane. It's called aeolian. It's like sand dunes. And then it hardened. And then above that is another limestone layer, which is, again, laid down by water. So it's really hard to imagine how you could get a water lane layer, an air wind laid layer, this is harder to say than think, and then cover it all over again with another water lane layer. And do all this within a period of a couple weeks. So the creationist geology just really doesn't make any sense. But we do have an awfully good time at Grand Canyon. So think about it and come with us. This is the great unconformity, and I'm right. Another example of how creationists try to disprove an ancient Earth is by claiming that human and dinosaur footprints exist together in Texas and elsewhere. I turned this upside down so you could see it. Dinosaur and human footprints found together in Texas. Of course, all creatures were created at the same time. So humans coexisted with dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals. These are all from the creationist literature. The flood of Noah was an historical event. Noah and his family tended a boatload of animals for almost a year, and all land animals are descended from these creatures, and dinosaurs were originally vegetarian. People sometimes say, you're making fun of creationists. No, I'm not. I'm making fun of creationist ideas, which is not the same thing. And these illustrations are from the creationist website, so I'm not making these things up. This is what they consider to be, persuasive evidence for to persuade people to these beliefs. But since God created everything in 6 days, mammoths and pteranodons and dinosaurs and people were all created at one time, so therefore they all lived together at one time. If you want to know more about why dinosaurs and humans didn't live together and why the Texas and other man tracks are not evidence of this coexistence, NCSE.com, we have a little journal, Creation Evolution. All of this is online, and you could take a look at this. And of course, many of you are very familiar with the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum a bit north of here, in which you can have your picture taken on baby Triceratops. I thank Dan Phelps for the photograph. It is not the case, however, that dinosaurs and humans live together, and there's a great deal of evidence against it, and none for it. Now, one thing that Darwin would have been really surprised about is the extent of Islamic creationism, the rise of Islamic anti-evolutionism. The migration of large numbers of Muslims from the Middle East and other parts of the world to Europe was unknown in Darwin's time. The writings of the Turkish creationist Adnan Oktar, writing as Harun Yahya, are widespread in the Muslim community, and in Great Britain there's much opposition to evolution in the Muslim community, even at the university level. Oktar has been inspired by American Young Earth Creationists. During the 1980s and 90s, speakers from the Institute for Creation Research traveled to Turkey and to promote their particular form of creationism. Harun Yahya and his team that produce all of these materials basically took the anti-evolutionism from the American Young Earth Creationists. They sort of ignored the young age of the earth stuff. They thought that was kind of dopey. But they kept the anti-evolution part of it. And there's a huge, huge number of books and pamphlets and videos, and there's a very extensive website in English, and it's also in Farsi, it's also in Arabic and Urdu, lots and lots of attempts to reach Muslims around the world with the idea that evolution is bad. Many of you are familiar with the Atlas of Creationism, especially if you're a university professor. You might have received one of these. Volumes 1 to 3 are published so far, and they have 10 planned, which boggles the mind, because how can you say the same thing 10 times over? They've already said it 3 times over. Basically, this book consists of very, very beautiful pictures of living organisms, organisms that are living today, and fossil organisms, and there's no difference in between them, therefore evolution didn't take place. And it's page after page after page of this. And they're beautifully illustrated, very expensively produced. True 4-color print. This particular picture is of a lovely caddisfly, and how there are caddisfly fossils found in ambers, and there's no difference between them, so therefore evolution didn't take place. Harun Yahya doesn't seem to be terribly concerned about where he gets his pictures. He seems to have stolen a lot of them from National Geographic. I think copyright laws may be somewhat laxly applied in Turkey, but they are certainly beautiful pictures. The caddisfly was also stolen, but it was from an advertisement for a guy who makes fishing lures. If you look carefully at that caddisfly, you will see it has a very painful-looking hook in the abdomen. And just in case you missed that the first time through, what can I say? And actually, to tell you the truth, the accuracy of the rest of the book is not a lot better. Islamic anti-evolutionism is more widely spread than just in Turkey, however. Here is a textbook from Saudi Arabia where it's basically dissing evolution. And notice the last sentence: we do not need to pursue such a theory as evolution because we have in the Book of Allah the final say regarding the origin of life, that all living things are Allah's creation. So we can dispense with evolution. Now, as in Turkey, in this textbook and in some other places, but especially in Turkey, you'll find anti-evolutionism is also, it's not just a religious issue like it is pretty much in the United States and North America. In Turkey, it's also mixed up with politics. It's sort of an anti-Western kind of thing, because evolution is Western, therefore we're against it. And it's also anti-Islamic, so we have 2 reasons to be against it. But a lot of the packaging that Harun Yahya has of his materials is also beating the drum against Westernization. If you know anything about Turkish politics, Turkey is a secular Islamic state as of its founding as a modern state, but there's a great deal of pressure by the conservative Muslims to turn it into an Islamic state like Iran and not be a secular state. Now, one thing that Darwin would have been absolutely stunned by is the rise of Hindu anti-evolutionism. The Krishna consciousness movement in the United States, sponsored by the Bhaktivedanta Institute, has been beating on evolution in its own way, although not in a way that really the Young Earth Creationists are very happy with, because just as the Young Earth Creationists interpret the Bible literally and therefore evolution isn't true because the Bible's only 6,000 years old, the Krishna creationists interpret the Vedas literally, and therefore the world is 350 million years old, and time is cyclical, and we're just sort of going round and round in different cycles, and that basically the fossil record is to be, forbidden archaeology. These are supposedly things that archaeologists aren't telling you. Whenever somebody tells you that, suspect that there may be less to it than meets the eye. Conspiracy theories are always should put your BS detector on, and this is a good example of the need for that. In the 1990s, Mysterious Origins of Man was produced and shown on network television, NBC, believe it or not, and it presented the world the idea that there were serious problems with evolution, and offering proof from the Bhaktivedanta Institute's Forbidden Archaeology book. This was basically commissioned by the Krishna Creationists, and Charlton Heston narrated it, so you know it sounded very authoritative. So there would be a lot of things about modern-day creationism that Darwin would find very puzzling, and some things that he would find, alas, quite familiar. But when I think about how Darwin would react to today's science situation, what I'm struck by is how Darwin would have been so excited by the growth of the real science of astronomy, geology, and biology that has done nothing other than to fully cement the ideas that he presented in 1859 in his book On the Origin of Species, and in several volumes thereafter. By the way, that wasn't the only book he wrote. That was the 9th book he wrote, and he wrote several volumes thereafter. He was an extremely productive scientist. As a geologist, Darwin would have just been overjoyed at the idea of plate tectonics, because the movement of continents around the planet explains so many things of fossil biogeography that were puzzles in Darwin's time, and were puzzles in our time until the mid-20th century or thereabouts, when plate tectonics became well accepted. Another thing that Darwin would have just found so exciting is Mendelian genetics, which was so very important in helping the science community accept the idea of evolution by natural selection. The mechanism of natural selection that Darwin presented in On the Origin of Species didn't work very well during Darwin's day. People pretty quickly accepted the idea of common ancestry. But even Huxley was a little bit cautious about accepting natural selection. Incidentally, that's completely the opposite of what modern-day creationists believe. They accept natural selection, but they deny common ancestry. But it was when Mendelian genetics were discovered and developed and more fully understood in the first half or thereabout of the 20th century, well after Darwin's death, that the idea that natural selection really had a source of variation upon which natural selection could work, so to speak. Really, natural selection really became a tenable idea at that point, and it became really the bedrock of the concept of adaptation. How much more excited Darwin would be by the discovery of the molecular basis of heredity. Darwin, Crick, DNA, RNA, and of course all of the molecular phylogenies that we can do today. He would just have been extraordinarily excited by these new developments. From the beginnings, Darwin used developmental biology. He used the development of organisms from embryo to adult, from egg to embryo, as showing evolutionary patterns. By the way, let me just take a minute here, because creationists have taken drawings like this and said, they're faked, they're faked. These are stylized drawings by Ernst Haeckel, who was a 19th century scientist. Haeckel did make some of his drawings look more like others, but the bigger point is that Haeckel was right about the basic relationship between embryology and evolution. What Haeckel was pointing out is that groups that are related, take a look at the right-hand side, you've got a pig, it's hard to see that, a pig, a rabbit, a monkey, and a human. The earlier you are within this related group of vertebrates, the more similar the embryos. As the branch, as members of the branch develop in utero, they get more and more distinct. There were a lot of principles that Haeckel developed that really are still accurate today. The more closely related you are, the more similar your embryological development, just as the more closely related you are, the more similar your anatomy, the more similar your biochemistry. The basic principle of homology, if you know about homology, applies to embryos as well as to every other aspect of living things. And of course, today, again, through the developments that have come up in molecular biology, we know a great deal more about the genes that are involved in setting out the different body plans of different organisms. And we know that within a group, such as mammals, or within a subgroup such as artiodactyls or primates, we know that the genes that are responsible for building that primate or building that cow are much more similar to the genes in more closely related species and more dissimilar the further away you go. And we've also learned, which just would have delighted Darwin, because it's something that nobody during his time would ever have thought of, is that even species as far removed as a fruit fly, which is an insect, of course, and a mammal, which is a vertebrate, and they have not shared ancestors in a very, very, very long time, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. The same genes that say build a segment, or this is the front end of the body, this is the back end of the body, this is the top, this is the bottom. Those genes are conserved through evolutionary development. It's, you know, the kind of stuff that's coming in the relatively new field of evolution and development, or as they call it, evo-devo, because they're smart alecks, are just mind-boggling. There's just really, really exciting things that have that Darwin would never have thought of before. He never knew anything about genetics. The fossil record has improved in so many ways. You know, if you read on the origin of species, in the first edition, he was speculating about whales, because nobody knew anything about whales, but it's obvious that the anatomy and the physiology of whales is, you know, is very similar to that of land animals. I mean, whales are not fish. Whales are mammals. And, you know, all of the mammals that we know that are in the sea are related to and look a lot more like land mammals than they look like anything else in the sea. So, you know, how the heck did a land mammal get into the water and become something like a whale or a seal or something like that? And so Darwin was just sort of speculating, and he sort of speculated that, you know, something like a bear, you know, might have been swimming around and through natural selection on exploiting these aquatic resources, perhaps the bear might have developed these characteristics that we associate with whales, which are characteristics of the teeth and of the ear and the movement of the nostril to the, you know. He really didn't know. He was just BSing, basically. And people jumped on him for that. And he kind of took that out of subsequent issues or editions of Origin of Species, because he was kind of embarrassed by it too. Well, he would have been so happy to find something like Indohyus, which is a relatively recently discovered fossil that shows a lot of the characteristics that are required, shall we say, the structural characteristics required for moving a land mammal to an amphibious mammal to ultimately a fully marine mammal. And of course, since Darwin's time, we have a lot more fossil whales showing these structural characteristics of the teeth, the dentition, the breathing system, even characteristics of the skull that suggest echolocation in more recent ones. So Darwin would have been really happy to have gotten off the hook when it came to the evolution of whales. And just imagine how happy Darwin would have been with human evolution and what we know from the fossil record today. At the time of Darwin, there were only 2 or 3 human fossils known. The Neander skull cap which is from the Neander Valley in Germany, which is where Neanderthals get their name. But this is just a small sample of the crania of the skulls that are known in human evolution. There are many more, and there's many more fragments. These are just sort of more or less the most complete ones. It makes a pretty picture. I thank my friend Matt Cartmill for this. I would challenge anybody to draw a line and say, okay, on this side it's all ape, on this side it's fully human. Darwin would have been delighted at the amount of fossil evidence there is for human evolution. And of course, in The Origin of Species, Darwin talked a lot about biogeography, about the distribution of plants and animals, and how the patterns that you saw on a continent, say, and from continents to island populations and so forth, these biogeographic patterns would be best explained by the idea that living things had common ancestors. It was one of the really strongest inferences in Origin of Species. He would have been delighted that there's been so much more research in biogeography since his time, and that in fact there's some really quite lovely popular books on biogeography, such as David Quammen's Song of the Dodo, really, really good stuff. And yet, just these well-supported principles and observations, like fossils and molecular homologies, embryology, and biogeography, are questioned by the creationists, this specifically in the most recent intelligent design effort to bring confusions to school, a book called Explore Evolution. So, what would Darwin say to these creationists? Well, he'd probably give them his sternest gaze and ask, haven't you been paying attention during the last 153 years? Actually, he was such a mild-mannered person, he probably wouldn't, but he would have been feeling this for sure. Well, you can find a great deal more information about Darwin, about evolution, about the creationism and evolution controversy, about lots of things that I hope you will find interesting on NCSE's website, which is ncsc.com. And if you go to this button over here, you can sign up for a free electronic newsletter, which we will send you every Friday. It's just a little button, bulleted list of things that you might find interesting to learn about the creationism and evolution issue and climate change. I need to change my screen here, don't I? And if you go to the news button here, you will be taken to this page, and for those of you students who might be doing papers on this topic or looking for paper topics, you can sort by year or by state, what's going on in your state, and find out a great deal about what's going on in the creationism and evolution controversy. We are a membership organization, so obviously we would be delighted for you people who aren't impecunious students to join. And with students, when you get rich, you can join too. NCSE.com, my staff is Glenn Branch, the Deputy Director. Robert Lunn is Communications Director. Peter Hess is our Religious Community Outreach Director. And Josh Rosenow and Steve Newton are our flare-ups wranglers. They're the ones who answer the phone when you elect the wrong school board. And they will, we all, help give advice to people who are trying to resolve these problems involving the teaching of evolution, whether it involves either denigrating evolution or getting it out of the curriculum, which is the creationism du jour, or actually there are attempts to get creationism into the curriculum even today. And Eric Mickle is our education director, and Mark McCaffrey is our newest colleague, and he is the climate change guy, because what NCSE has found is that not only do teachers get hammered for the teaching of evolution, which is the consensus view of science, but nonetheless people don't want them to do that. So also is there a movement out there to try to get teachers to not teach about global warming and other climate change ideas. And we think that maybe we have some experience that we can maybe help teachers in coping with this controversial issue. Controversial in public, not controversial in science. So we welcome Mark and we're delighted to have his expertise. We are on YouTube. We are on Facebook. Every good nonprofit is on YouTube and Facebook. Steve Gould is holding the world's best biological bumper sticker. Honk if you understand punctuated equilibrium, which if you are a biologist is just knee-slappingly funny. It's, the rest of you are going, lower your expectations on honks, okay? But when you get a honk, it is such high quality. I'll be sitting at a stoplight and somebody go beep, beep, and I'm saying, light's red, you jerk, what are you doing? And I'll look in the rearview mirror and somebody's going, oh yeah. And then what you want to do is you want to watch the people in the rearview mirror, okay? So you're watching the people getting all excited about, and usually the driver, somebody's looking kind of confused, and the person next to him's going, there are biologists in the room. That's right. I also am, my staff has inflicted me upon Facebook as well. If you wish to be my friend, please go to eugenie.scott. Not that everybody's clamoring to be my friend, but there's a bunch of other Genie Scott pages out there, but this is the one I update, so go here if you are interested. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon.